Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 324 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. In the final of our three-part series featuring interviews with counselling and psychotherapy professionals, we continue exploring the topic of regulation. Today, I'm joined by returning guest Meg Moss, Head of Policy at the NCPS, the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society. She will share her insights on the ongoing call for regulation from the perspective of a professional body. Now, if you missed the first two interviews on this topic, first with Dr. Anna Guy and the second with Susie Jameson, you can find them on our website at counsellingtutor.com. Just go to the podcast tab and look for episodes 322 and 323. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ken.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 324 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Both Rory Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly, are absolutely delighted that you've joined us. And if you are listening to the podcast in real time, kind of as we put them out, then a very happy new year to you. And I wonder how you are finding yourself today, Rory.
Well, I'm finding myself slightly larger than before the Christmas break, that's for sure. But I'm in good spirits, Ken, and looking forward to 2025, which I'm hoping is going to be a absolutely super year for everybody.
Yes, and it's strange that the episode is 324. It would have been amazing if it was 325, wouldn't it? We're having the 25 in it for 2025 in real time when we're doing this. So the topics that we're covering today, we'll start off with ethical, sustainable practice. Today we're going to be speaking about managing risk if you're working online or remotely with a client, so not in the room face to face, but there is some technology connecting you. Then what do we need to look at regarding risk management? We then go on to practice matters. It's the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And if you've been listening to our past episodes, you'll notice that we've been covering regulation from time to time. And today we're going into regulation with Meg Moss from the NCPS, that's the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society here in the United Kingdom. It's part 3 of this topic. And then, of course, we go into student services, where we recognise you, your student, on your formal journey to become a counsellor or a psychotherapist. And today we're going to be speaking about the importance of contracting, one of my favourite topics. And I think probably a word, if you took all of the Counselling Tutor podcasts, put them into AI, because that's all the only way you'd be able to find this out. I think that the most mentioned word across all of our podcasts will probably be contracting or attachment.
Yes.
Two topics we discuss a lot. So contracting coming up later in student services. Ethical, sustainable practice, managing risk in online therapy. And I guess I'll start by asking the uninformed question, Rory. There's a risk when we work online?
Well, there is, yes, and it may be not as apparent as people think. If you're working in the room with a client, the client's in front of you, and so if anything goes wrong, client becomes ill, which has happened to colleagues of mine, that you know exactly where the client is, and you can call emergency services and get some help. I know when I worked for Mind, a couple of my colleagues had to call emergency services because people became unwell, and I used to supervise someone who worked for Age Concern, and certainly a couple of her clients who were older people, because Age Concern usually works with older people, indeed became unwell when they were having a counselling session, and it was just a very easy procedure of calling 999 here in the UK. I mean, in other countries it's a different number, but that's our emergency services number here in the UK. And an ambulance attended, and the person was given the help they needed. But if you're working remotely, then that becomes a really different proposition, because you need the information to be able to point the emergency services to where the client is. So, at the time of making this podcast, Ken and myself are in the same studio. I'm based outside Manchester. Ken's based in Wales. And, we have each other's names and addresses. And there's a very good reason for that, because if anything happened, either of us could contact the emergency services and get the help we need. And that's the kind of thinking that needs to be in the front of our minds when we work online. Basic safety protocols dictate. I hate to use that word dictate, but I think it's that word. For the work we're doing, that we have a contact information for a client, so we know where they are. But as we'll go through this, there's a little bit more to it than that.
Yes.
Ken.
Some nuance. It's interesting you speaking about us having one another's contact details, emergency contact details, and the same is for our entire team at Counselling Tutor, because we are a remote working company, pretty much spread across the world, to be honest with you, and we hold contact information and emergency contact information on all of our team members, and we have had occasion where we needed to dip into that. So it is real, and it does happen, not just in therapy, but just in online, in general, it how we show up. And what occurs to me is when we're working via a technology, whether that be online, via a video app, or if you're using a telephone, or if you're texting, however you might be working with the technology that kind of sits between you and your client, you don't see and feel what you see and feel in a face-to-face therapy room. There it is. I've said it. If you're working on video, you may say, well, I see my client, but do you? You see a little passport-sized photo, really, because that's kind of what we get when we're working online. So much that we rely on in terms of visual cues, non-verbal communication can be lost when working remotely. Right now, Rory, can you see my hands? Am I clasping them? Or am I wringing them? Are they sitting relaxed? Are they rested on my knees? Where are they?
I don't know, Ken. I can only see
Can't see them.
Can't see any hands. No hands are there. No, there they are. He's doing
I'm doing
jazz
hands now.
He's doing his jazz hands.
So there you go. So we have the higher risk presentations. We would think very carefully before working online or remotely with a high risk presentation. We would first of all know that we have the competence to work with that area. But then again, we would revisit, is it appropriate to work with that client online? Now, Rory and I are not here to say who you can and who you can't work with. We're here to have the discussion to get you to think about, is this a presentation that I think feel confident and competent to work with online? So for an example, I'm going to give an example of a presentation that I would not work with in an online or using remote technology. And this is just me personally. It doesn't mean that others don't work within this area, maybe with different boundaries and a different process. But for me, I would not work with somebody who was coming in who maybe had an addiction problem or an alcohol-related challenge, and that they were coming into therapy to overcome that, to stop the drinking, to become clean from that, to get into what they call recovery, I guess. And the reason is I would find it really difficult to ascertain where that client was if they were not in the room. If they were in the room, you have little hints that you might see. Maybe you would see maybe a smell of alcohol would be a telltale sign that you may get in a room, but you're not going to get that in an online setting. You reliant on how that client chooses to share with you.
Yes, and I also think that also speaks to psychological contact, Ken, because if you're working with someone who's in active addiction, be it we're going to use the idea of maybe drugs or alcohol. You might not be able to get a sense as if they're under the influence, and certainly in my practice experience, I could think of one or two clients who've presented, and clearly they were highly under the influence of something. One was definitely alcohol because I could smell it. And I thought to myself, is this person in a place actually to look at themselves? Because that's what therapy is about, isn't it? Sometimes to look at your own processes in a way that is safe. If someone's under the influence, then that alters the way people think. That's my view. And as Ken said, we're not here to dictate to people how to practice. And you can't get a sense of that, if you're working online. So I think, like you, Ken, I'd be slightly hesitant to work online with someone who was in active addiction. Although I have to caveat that, I think, by saying that might be about the contracts and getting to know the client and having perhaps an extended interview with the client, pre-therapy meetup.
Yes.
So it's not written in stone, but those are the kind of things. The other thing is that I've worked with a lot of people, mainly women, I have to say, but occasionally men, who are very vulnerable. They're in very abusive relationships, and as we know, it takes quite a lot of both courage and also reflection for people to leave abusive relationships. It's very easy to say, well, why don't you leave them? But, we all know trauma bonding, financial situations, real fear of violence can keep people in relationships for years because they can't find a way to leave. But some do. And if I was working with a client, or a client contacted me for online therapy and said, well, actually, I might have to go very quickly because if my partner comes in, I could be beaten up, I think I'd have to think long and hard about that, because that could be quite dangerous. I wouldn't say I wouldn't, but I think we'd have to have a long think about that, because that also becomes a safety issue. If you're working with someone and they know that any minute they can be attacked, are they going to be in a position to be able to process the therapy if they're literally sat with the fear of the door opening? So I think those are things to consider. And maybe talk with your supervisor. I think, talk with your supervisor, talk with your peers. Don't dismiss people out of hand. We know, neither myself and Ken are saying we should dismiss these two client examples, but it is a safety risk factor that you need to keep in the forefront of your mind, I think.
Yes, very much so. And the topic of this section that we're covering right now is managing risk in online therapy. It's not here's people you can work with and here's people you can't. No. It's where we're identifying that there may be an added risk or a need for really thinking it through. And like you say, Rory, you'd really need to think it through of how you might work with a person from their unique circumstances. And we're not suggesting not to work with people at all, but just that we do visit the risk and mitigate that by putting something in place, speaking to your supervisor, you've already said. And another one that comes to mind is maybe somebody who has a serious medical condition. It could be diabetes. It could have been that they've just had a recent stroke or a heart attack, and they're now re-looking at their life and wanting to get a different perspective on their life post this. But if they are potentially vulnerable to having another episode of that, it just highlights the importance of having those emergency services. We would think long and hard, and we would revisit our contract, and we would revisit our working agreement with our clients when we see these higher risk presentations. So serious medical conditions, addictions, domestic violence, if you said. And of course, as you were speaking about domestic violence, I was just mindful that you can only see what the camera sees when you're working as a therapist. You don't know if there's somebody in the room that person is having to behave in a certain way, So we would work with someone if they were presenting with domestic violence presentation, a vulnerable person. We would work with them pre the therapy, pre the sessions, to make sure that they are safe, or to make sure that they can in some way give us a sign. And there are signs. We cover these things in our online and telephone counselling course that we offer. And if you're interested in training and really focusing down on this really important area, then just go to counsellingtutor.com. Our training is there. So also, I guess, higher risks such as self-harm, suicidal thinking, those would be an added consideration if you're working online or via a technological interface between you and your client. So we've identified, Rory, that there may be some higher risks. How would we unearth these risks before we end up in session number 3 and then it gets dropped on us and we realize that we might not have put the preparation in place?
Well, I think before we do that, Ken, I think we've talked predominantly about video. And people and practitioners who can see their clients. For those people who are partially sighted or not sighted at all those who work on the phone, it becomes even more difficult. But to answer the question, how we would mitigate the risk is by having a discovery conversation with the client. The 30-minute introduction session, which a lot of therapists have. And they find it's really useful for getting to know clients, but also clients getting to know them so they feel comfortable in working together. And also maybe some form of a questionnaire where you could ask a question, you've got the health issues, any safety issues. I mean, the thing is that even with the best discovery calls and the best documentation where people fill in a form, it only mitigates risk so much because people may not tell you the truth. That does happen. But by having, I think, a very clear contract, a very clear discovery call where you're talking to the client and getting a sense of them and what they want to work on, and also a discovery form. And that, by a discovery form, I mean a questionnaire which asks about health, which asks about where they are getting their name and address and details. Sometimes even getting a trusted person's details. So it might be the person in therapy's got a friend they're talking about having therapy, and you might want to take those details. So if something goes wrong, you can call the friend to go across as well, with the agreement of the client, and making sure that those are updated. I think the thing here, Ken, is that information shouldn't be static just because we've put that information down at the beginning of a series of therapy sessions. It should be revisited and updated. Any risk profiles should be updated, and they should be discussed with the client. They shouldn't be done in secret. It should be, can we just take a few minutes just to, you've told me this, and, let's have a look at what we talked about initially about risk. It should be an open, honest conversation for the benefit of the client.
100%. And this is not just for when you're working with technology, online or telephone or text. This applies to face-to-face in the room just as much. Risk management, a risk management plan, or you can call it your intake form. So your intake form, that session that you have where you say, let's spend 20 minutes just discussing what you're looking for. You can have an intake form, something that the client can fill in, or questions that you might ask that would highlight if there is an underlying risk. And when you observe an underlying risk, you're going to build a risk management plan, and you're going to share that risk management plan with your client. So I'm just going to give you an example here. So let's say I'm working with a client. That client has just come out of hospital. They've had a life-threatening heart attack where they actually died for 3 minutes, but they were brought back, and they've got this new perspective on life. They're wanting to dive into their past and revisit that. I might recognize that they're in recuperation. They may be tired. They may be sluggish. They may be prone to high emotions might trigger them off again. I might discuss this with the client, and I might say, I would need to get certain details from you should you become unwell when we're in a session, that I may contact the person, the designated person. So there's a risk management plan of why we're doing it, what we might do, and we're contracting that with the client. And that is going to be as unique as the clients that present. And you can, of course, look to your supervisor if you're unsure on your risk management plan. There's a lot of information out about risk management planning for clients. There's CPD you can do on it. And it does apply in the room as well as online. But online, we just take into consideration that distance and the technology that sits as an additional barrier to communication, really. And is that client safe? What can I do if that client becomes unsafe? So that I think is important information, Rory.
Absolutely. And one final thing is that sometimes clients aren't static. So pay attention, if you're working on video and the client comes in and they're in a different room or they're in a different location, say to them, I've noticed that you've changed the room you're in. Are you in the same location? And that question might elicit, well, actually, no, I've moved house, in which case it wouldn't take very long just to get the new details. And also sometimes clients will drive and park up somewhere. I've worked with clients who've parked in, the car park of some woods because they feel it's a safe space for them, or a country park. And just to get an idea of where they are, and there are ways of doing that. We won't go into it on the podcast, but we do cover it in the training we offer. Just to make sure that we can get help to them when we need them. And I think one thing that sometimes isn't picked up, but where it's really essential, is end-of-life work, where you might be working with clients who've got life-limiting conditions, and they may be getting progressively ill. And having contact details can be very helpful, because sometimes people come to therapy and then they become very unwell because of the medication or the condition, and they may need some form of assistance. So I think all in all, there's so much to think about. What strikes me with this conversation, Ken, there's so much more to think about than when you're just working in the room. It becomes there's so much more. It's a whole new ball game, if I can borrow an Americanism.
Yes, I like to think that we're now in an age where a therapist knows that they don't just graduate and go with their counselling qualification and go, oh, I'm going to now do this online on the phone, that we recognise that training is required. There are additional competences that are required. If you look to your ethical body, they will suggest what those additional competences are. And there are psychological phenomena that play out online or via technology that don't play out in the room. It's different. Be like studying counselling and just leaving out attachment theory because that's not important. It doesn't match with my modality. Of course it does. It's still there. It plays out in the room. I want to leave one last thing. We speak about knowing where the client is and that risk management, and something that came out from one of the students that was on our online and telephone counselling training course, and this was some years ago. This was a few years ago. They shared something that has now been added to our course, and we use it often, and it's called What 3 Words. And this is really useful when you're working with a client and you don't necessarily know where they are. They could be in a field, they could be camping. They could have gone away over the holidays and be in the middle of a field that doesn't have a real address? Well, it does actually. There's an amazing little application and a website called What 3 Words. Just pop it in Google, go and have a look at it, and go find your house. Go find your house on that, and it'll tell you exactly where you are. And it gives you 3 words. The whole world is divided up into these, I think it's a meter size squares, each one having a word. So what I've done is I've just jumped on this What 3 Words app now, and I'm very happy to share with you that the coconut tree in Oxford, which is like a little bar, is Charmingly Farms Boost. That's its 3 words. And that is unique to that place. Unique to that place. So when you're using 3 words, you can be speaking to somebody and know exactly where they are anywhere in the world. There it is. So that is our topic today.
And it's free.
Closing
it's
thoughts? Free. It is free. It is free. Yes,
it's free. That's perfect.
Any closing thoughts? I'm mindful we can use mental health questionnaires and the paperwork that is available to us as counsellors for unearthing that risk. And of course, we've already spoken how we would then cover that, make a risk management plan, how this would be covered in our contract, that we would revisit it on a regular basis, that we would recognise that there are certain presentations that may show as a higher risk. Medical conditions may flag something up for us, addiction, maybe domestic violence. So anything else as we come to the end of this topic?
Well, I think about keeping the risk profile updated, and certainly when it comes to what's sometimes clinically called suicidal ideation, which I think is a very cold phrase for people considering ending their own lives, not to rely just on things like PHQ-9. So PHQ-9 is a questionnaire that is sometimes given out to clients where you can you tick boxes and you can give them a score on certain things. One's on suicidal ideation, and recently there's been a change in the use of these questionnaires. So if you take one and the client's very low score for suicidal ideation, don't rely on that score all the time, because it might be that the client does it and at that time they feel okay. And then as you're working through the arc of therapy, things change. They give you hints and indications, or you pick up themes from the client that they may be considering taking their own life. And, you cannot, if you're ever questioned in a coroner's court about, did the clients ever give you an indication? It's not really good enough to say, well, we did at the beginning of 10 sessions, I did this form and they said it was low. And then it comes out that through the arc of therapy, they were giving very clear indications they were thinking of taking their own life. So all risk profiles should be live, really, updated and updated with the consent of the client. It's a joint venture. A risk profile is a joint venture, and work with the clients on that, but don't just do it and then file it in a drawer.
It's almost like it gives you an audit trail, doesn't it, Rory? It gives you an audit trail that you can use for defendable decision making of why you did what you did at the time you did it, by going and saying, every session we checked where that client was. This is where they said they were when I saw this and they presented with this. We revisited the risk management plan, and you've got a step by step of your entire process of how you held professionally that client. Well, we've got something to help you, because it's a lot of information that we've shot at you here. We've got a handout. It's really, really nice. It's in depth. It's called Managing Risks in Online Therapy. It goes through some high risk presentations. It goes through risk management. It speaks about using mental health questionnaires as well, and the reason why we need contact information and what an ethical body has to say on that. And you can get that super duper free handout on today's topic by going to counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab, make your way to episode number 300 324. That's today, 324. And right there on that page, you can download the super duper handout, Managing Risk in Online Therapy. And of course, if you feel that you would like to train in this area, we have a course at Counselling Tutor. Over 10,000 therapists across the world have taken our online and telephone counselling certificate course. And you can go and look at that by going to counsellingtutor.com and you'll see it's there. Buy our products. There it is. That was Ethical Sustainable Practice for today. And we now move on to Practice Matters, the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Rory, you've already beautifully introduced Meg, but you spoke to Meg Moss from NCPS, and this is part 3 on the topic of regulation.
It is. This is the third interview that I've undertaken on the calls for regulation after the Ella Jenner case, which those who are regular listeners to the podcast will know of. This is a client who, after a long struggle, has finally got a remedy, that's the legal term, against her therapist for assault against the person. It was a civil case, but she alleged rape and sexual assault. It was an awful case to read. And that, in some areas, and certainly her barrister I read, has asked for the government to look at regulation. So in episodes 322, 323, and in this episode, we have interviewed Meg Moss from the National Counselling Society to get a professional body's view on regulation and what it might look like, and if we actually do need regulation. I caught up with Meg, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
In our previous episodes 322 and 323, we heard opinions from practitioners Dr. Anna Guy and Susie Jameson as they shared their views on statutory regulation in counselling and psychotherapy in the UK, a topic currently being discussed in the media, UK Parliament and in the psychotherapeutic community. In this final interview on the subject, we welcome back a regular contributor to the podcast, Meg Moss, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, also known as the NCPS, to gain her perspective on the possible impact of regulation on our profession. So, Meg Moss, you're so welcome back.
Oh, hello. Thank you. It's lovely to be back again.
Well, it's lovely to see you. I'm really interested in your take on this. One of the reasons this has, I think, come to the forefront of our minds is the media reporting of the case of Ella Jenner. Now, we discussed this in episode 322 and 323. A counselling client who was in the press release was sexually abused and raped, although there wasn't a criminal prosecution. It took 8 years to get a civil remedy to this, and she was awarded over £200,000 in court recently. I'm talking, I think, in the October of 2024, if I remember the media reporting correctly. And one of the things that has happened is this has driven a lot of discussion about regulation, bringing back regulation onto the table. It's been discussed in the media, it's been discussed in Parliament, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely heartbreaking case, really. So, just that anyone has gone through that and the amount of time that it took for her to get justice. Really, really feel very strongly for her. And I think it's started a really important conversation, the importance of public safety and the trust that we place in our therapists. Counselling and psychotherapy often involve really kind of vulnerable disclosures. So it's it's really important that we have these conversations, and that we talk about ethical standards, we talk about accountability, and I want to really kind of start by recognizing that the public have really valid concerns about potential harm or abuse in therapy, and that it's really important for us to be talking about the need for safeguards that genuinely protect clients. So, but from the work that I've been doing, so I've been in the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society for nearly 10 years. We have done a lot of talking to our members over the years about the topic of regulation. This is something that's come up before, not really that long ago in the grand scheme of things. And ended up going to judicial review back in, I think, 2010, due to the harm that it would cause the profession to go through statutory regulation. And that's kind of what I'd like to talk about, is some of the challenges of statutory regulation. So the limitations being, statutory regulation primarily protects titles, so it would protect counsellor and psychotherapist, for example, but that doesn't necessarily stop harmful practitioners from doing harmful things. And those who do and are struck off because of the nature of the kind of work that we do could simply move to an unregulated title like a wellbeing coach or a talking therapist to continue practicing. So in kind of other regulated professions like doctors, like nurses, statutory regulation hasn't eliminated misconduct. I'm sure you can think of other high-profile cases where serious misconduct has happened, and we can kind of talk about that. So regulation alone doesn't prevent harm. What I think we really need to be talking about is meaningful enforcement of standards and ethics and public awareness. We really need to do more around public awareness. And so for me, what we have at the moment, we have the Accredited Registers Programme, which was set up back in 2012 and is overseen by the Professional Standards Authority, who also oversee statutory regulators like the General Medical Council, the General Optical Council, dentists, nurses. So the AR programme is really robust and has the oversight of an organisation that really know what they're doing when it comes to standards and ethics and public protection. But what it does, while it kind of has this robust kind of framework for accountability and public safety, it and kind of the ethical standards, but it also has this flexibility for that allows a diversity of therapeutic practices, different approaches. It's not something that you have in medicine, for example. I've heard people say, why is counselling and psychotherapy treated differently from the medical profession, for example? I mean, because it is different. We're a very, very different type of thing. I suppose there's a different conversation there that you could talk about the medicalisation of therapy, which I also love to talk about, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. And we have this kind of, at the moment now, where the Accredited Register Programme has become like the de facto regulator for the profession. So most directories require their therapists to be on an accredited register. In fact, all of the directories that are worth their salt in the UK require practitioners to register, which means that the public can really rely on that as the standard. And why are we talking about reinventing the wheel when the AR programme is already effective? We've pumped hundreds of thousands of pounds of kind of public money or our, therapist money in terms of membership fees into the AR programme. And this, where statutory regulation potentially presents a one-size-fits-all model and approach to counselling and psychotherapy, the AR programme respects the nuance and the diversity that we have. I don't think people outside the profession really appreciate how creative and varied a lot of the approaches are to working in a psychotherapeutic way with people. I've waffled on. Did you?
Yeah, I mean, I've just been listening intently to what you're saying, and I think I pick up on 2 points, Meg. One is that regulation may cause a false dichotomy, and something that I've named the Shipman paradox. I trained in Hyde 20 years ago, and there was a physician called Dr. Harold Shipman. I'm sure infamous. People know him, and he murdered, depending on the sources that you look at, up to 250 people. He held a protected title and was part of a regulated profession. And speaking with Dr. Anna Guy in the last episode, in episode 323, one of the things that came up was that it could create a false sense of security for clients, in that they believed that they were totally safe because it was regulated. And I pick up on the other point that you made, which was about our profession being different. Yes, we are professional therapists, but we rely, a lot of therapists, not all, but a lot of therapists rely on a very interpersonal relationship, a very different connection between our clients and ourselves than maybe a doctor or a dentist would have. And one of the things that Dr. Anna Guy discussed, as I say in episode 323, was that it's very possible that with regulation, people will be so worried about making a mistake that they may practice defensively. In other words, that essence of the relationship, which we know is a huge contributor to positive outcomes in psychotherapy, and I'm talking about common factors here, the work of John Norcross, very famously published work, which is evidence-based and is a subject of discussion at the moment about what really makes therapy work, might be lost. We may come to a very interpersonal engagement with clients, and that might not actually be in the favour of some clients.
No, and I love that you mentioned my other favourite thing, common factors, which is actually my favourite thing because of you, Rory, and one of our conversations we had years and years ago. That's an incredibly good point, is that that there is the impact that the relationship has, especially if you're going into like psychodynamic psychotherapy and transference and countertransference, and the impact that can have that isn't anything to do with whether you're practicing ethically or not, but it could have an impact on your client. How does that fit within a statutory regulatory framework where people who are on a professional conduct panel don't have the knowledge or experience to understand something like psychodynamic psychotherapy, or indeed, the different kind of relational challenges that can crop up as part of that relationship. Love that point. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're a very broad church, if I can use a kind of ecclesiastical, if that's the word. Ecclesiastical, it probably is, term. To say that we're very broad. Some people like myself are person-centered therapists. You've alluded to psychoanalytical therapy. And there's other people who use touching therapy, body workers, somatic therapists. Very many different approaches. And the reason there's so many approaches is that counselling and psychotherapy, in my humble opinion, is more about art than it is about science. And in fact, the evidence really stacks up to say that, we talk about common factors. It really stacks up to say that client choice and client motivation is one of the highest kind of indicators of positive outcomes in therapy, and also the relationship. And if either of those are somehow damaged or malformed during the commencement of therapy, then it's very unlikely going to get a positive outcome. One of the things that you've alluded to, and one of the things that I'd like to kind of explore a bit more, Meg, is awareness for clients. When I practiced, clients really hadn't got a clue what counselling was, and I had to spend a bit of time trying to explain what it was. And I think it's still a bit of a mystery to a lot of people who are looking for therapy. If you come from a place of not knowing about therapy, the mind-boggling different types of modalities can cause confusion. And also what you could expect from a therapy. What would a therapy do? And crucially, therapists do, and crucially not do. And I do think it comes down to information. If someone had some information and said, a therapist shouldn't touch you or do this or that or ask you out on a date, then you've got that information in front of you. But I'm not sure that that's something that's kind of abroad at the moment. I know that, professional bodies like yourself have done a great job in speaking to the public. But is there more that could be done?
I think there's definitely more that could be done. I think, especially in the younger generation, people are more open about talking about their experiences of therapy. So, for example, you're a Reddit user, like I am, avid Reddit user. There are kind of thousands and thousands people talking on there about their experiences of therapy and what you should expect and what you shouldn't expect. And these are not therapists. These are people that go to therapy, that use therapy. And I think that's a really good space to kind of start growing that understanding of, actually, it's not okay for your therapist to treat you badly or to touch you inappropriately or any of that kind of stuff. We are growing a cultural awareness that isn't coming from the top down. This is what you should know about therapy. And I think that that's how, actually we learn as a society is from the kind of the bottom up. There's more to be done. So that you do not go and see a doctor that practices from the end of his garden without any qualifications. Right? Like, we all kind of culturally know that you have to go to a doctor in a GP practice, or if you see a private doctor, you want to know what his qualifications are. You want to know that he's registered. And I would like to see that knowledge now being spread to the members of the public. Like, how can they make an informed choice about what to look for in a therapist? How can we encourage people to check that they have an accredited registered membership? How can we ask people to understand, if they can check what the ethical standards are and know what their rights are within that therapeutic relationship? It is a challenge getting information out to people who aren't necessarily looking for that information right now. But how can we make sure that's available to them when they are looking for a therapist, so that they're not caught up by someone who's very good at selling their practice, but maybe doesn't have the experience or the qualifications to actually support what they're doing in the therapy room. I would love to see a bigger public education piece. I know the Professional Standards Authority are investing a lot of money now advising the public about the Accredited Registers Programme. So hopefully we'll see a little bit more understanding of that as we go through. But I also think that there's a role for counsellors and psychotherapists to take on in making sure that their networks are aware of the importance of the Accredited Registers Programme. And those networks can then pass on that information. And we just, tell a friend, and that friend tells 3 friends, and that friend tells 3 friends, and suddenly everyone knows how important it is. I'm not sure it's as easy as that, but I'd like it to be. So
Yes.
yeah, because regardless, the where we are as a profession, the way that we work, this kind of relational talking therapy stuff, the fact that people could change their title to sidestep regulation pretty easily, as you see in other professions. I think it's like chiropody and podiatry. One is regulated and one isn't. I don't remember which way around it is. But this is something that could really happen very easily in the work that we do. So even with statutory regulation, clients could still unknowingly choose an unregulated practitioner if they don't know about regulation. And if I had a problem with my feet, I don't know, I would probably check right before I went to see someone, because this is the world that I'm in. But I might not. I might go to an unregulated practitioner without knowing it, not even knowing that I had to ask. So public awareness, really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I look back, 25 years ago, when I was looking for help for a loved one, for therapy for a loved one, I can remember the massive learning curve that myself and my wife went through, trying to make sense of all these people. We visited people who hopefully have gone. I suspect that they'd be under a different title now, but were effectively snake oil salespeople. And eventually we found therapy at local Mind, which gave us peace of mind, as a pun intended there. But it was a bit of a mystery, and I'm not sure that has got any better through the years. And just to pick up on the point you made about protecting titles, if someone's a doctor, a medical doctor, it's against the law to misrepresent yourself. And also having a doctor, being a medical doctor as opposed to a PhD, doctor of philosophy, it means that you get access to prescribing drugs, being able to do physical examinations, and things like that. Now, clearly, regulation there is really important, because you can't have anybody just say, well, I happen to be a gynecologist and, come to the shack at the end of the garden and I can sort all your problems out. However, with counselling and psychotherapy, it's such a broad church, if you like, that it would be very difficult to actually say, well, you can't really touch your clients. Well, somatic therapists might do. You can't do this, you can't do that. I think speaking to both Dr. Anna Guy and Susie Jameson, they both said much the same thing. First of all, it might lead us into defensive psychotherapy, where we just withdraw from the relationship and be just professional people, but not getting really connected with the client. But also, who's going to set is it going to be the practitioners who set the standards, or is it going to be some arbitrary professional body that have no idea of counselling and take no notice of those who practice and the expertise within that? So it could actually be one of those things where the road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions, and it might do more damage than good. It's been a really, really interesting conversation today, Meg. Thank you for your input. If you want to listen to Dr. Anna Guy and Susie Jameson's contributions to this discussion on regulation, please go to counsellingtutor.com, locate the podcast tab, and listen to episode 322 and 323. And I guess it just remains for me to say, Meg Moss, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to a regular on the Counselling Tutor Podcast, Meg Moss, and thank you to you, Rory, for reaching out, holding these all-important discussions. And that brings us to the end of Practice Matters. From Practice Matters, we head straight into Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. In Student Services today, we're recognising you, students, on your formal journey to become a counsellor, psychotherapist, and a topic that you're going to see often and work with every single client you ever see. It's contracting. It comes up again and again and again. Tell us about contracting, Rory. What do we need to know?
Well, I think before I speak specifically about contracting in counselling, I think it's useful to think about contracts that we have in our life in general. You know, anybody who's got a mobile phone signs a contract. I bought myself a jumper for Christmas and I bought it off eBay and I signed a contract with the buyer that I couldn't return it. And they sent me the jumper. And we have contracts all over. If you book a table to eat, you usually have to tick a box saying the terms and conditions. So contracts are very much part and parcel of everyday life. Probably we don't think of them as contracts. Sometimes they're called terms and conditions, but we'll come across them more than we think. And in counselling, contracts are really, really important because they have a number of functions. But in my mind, the biggest function is to balance the power differential out. Because if a therapist contracts with a client, they can make their offer, which is what a therapist is doing. They're making their offer to a potential client very, very clear. And that offer can include things like the fee. It can include things like the time spent, the number of sessions maybe. It could talk about breaches in confidentiality, when confidentiality could be breached. And that gives the client an opportunity to look at that. We talked about intake forms earlier on at the top of the podcast. And part of that would be to send the contract at some point and let the client have a look at it. And if the client looks at it and says, no, I don't want to agree to that, then that's fine. They can decline it and they can move on. I mean, there are some areas of contracts which you really can't alter. And that is things like the law, prevention of terrorism. If someone talks about terrorist-related activity, you're legally bound under UK law to disclose it. So, if a client says, well, I don't really want to talk, I've read a contract, I don't like that, I'm not going to go ahead with it. Well, that's fine. That's their decision. But contracts are useful for a lot of other things because they define boundaries. And I think that sometimes, and this is my personal musings over the years, is that having a contract can put a little bit of, how shall I put it politely, discipline into the proceedings, where clients who may have difficulty settling into fixed routines, it might give them pause for thought. When I talk about fixed routines, I mean in turning up at therapy. You can use a contract and say, well, you missed 4 sessions and we've contracted for 10. So just so you're aware of that. So contracts have a lot of, they have a lot of function, but I think the biggest function is for equalising the power and secondly, for defensible decision making. If you ever get called in front of a professional body, a complaint's made about you, say about the number of sessions you've offered, then the client says, well, I thought it was open-ended and you've got a contract saying you'd offer 10, then you can defend that. So they're an essential part of our work. And if they're clearly written and clearly stated, then both parties understand what they're getting.
Yes. Oh, beautifully introduced, Rory. And contracting is for me, it's like a protective bubble. It's an invisible bubble that is mutually agreed upon by the counsellor and the client, and it protects both the client and the counsellor and outlines exactly what happens, how counselling works, what they can expect. And I think, if you think about it, so often a client going into counselling is very unsure. I don't know, I've never been to counselling before. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to expect. And the contract helps a little bit with that process, and it kind of outlines what is on offer and how it is offered. So basic information, you'd share who you are as the counsellor. You're going to say who you are and what your qualifications are, if that person requires those. Maybe memberships to any accredited, any ethical bodies that you are accredited with, or that you have joined, and what that means. If you work to an ethical guideline, then perhaps you can make that ethical framework available to the client as well, so they understand that we are accountable for to as counsellors. There you go, tripping over the words. Then the purpose of counselling. So, of course, on the details, we'd also have the client's details, who they are, and their contact information if necessary. And we spoke about working online and the differences in our first topic today. So revisit that one to see if that is necessary. Purpose of counselling, explanation of what counselling is and what its goals are, keeping in mind that a person coming into counselling may very well be coming in going, I don't really know what this is. Now, we might go, I'm a person-centered counsellor, or I'm a transactional analysis, I work in TA, or I work in CBT, and the counsellor didn't go and do the course. The client didn't go and do the course. We've got to explain it in a way of who we are and what we do and what our modality is and what that means to them. So, and an acknowledgement of the client's role in that as well. Counselling is not us sat there telling them what to do and what's wrong and how to fix it. The client has a role in that. So we would outline the client's role within our contract as well. And then, of course, session details, the duration, the frequency, the location of those, and the platform, if appropriate. So if we're working with a technology, what that platform is. And then if we are working with any kind of online technology or platforms, the details around that. What does that client need to know about that platform? For example, I'm just going to use this as an example. Perhaps I use a video piece of software that many people use to connect with my client. Well, does it collect my client's details? Is everything that the client says within that platform private? We need to get informed consent. We need to tell the person what we're using if we're asking them to use it, and what's around that. Then, of course, you've got the fees and the payments, session fee. I still see regularly posts in our Facebook community of those sharing that they have a dilemma with maybe a client that didn't show up, and should I still charge them? Well, all of this is covered in your contract. You don't have to have those dilemmas if you think of them beforehand and you contract around that. And what is in your contract, we should stick to that. The contract is the document of truth. You mentioned, Rory, if a complaint is levied against a counsellor, undoubtedly the very first document that the board holding this complaint would look at is your contract. They're going to ask to see it because it is the document of truth. What is it you say, Rory? If it's not written down,
it doesn't exist.
It didn't happen. It didn't happen. You couldn't say, but I told them in session 3 that I was putting my fees up. You've got to have it in writing. It's got to be contracted. Cancellation policy, the payment terms, if you offer them, this is all under fees and payment, and refunds. They come for 10 sessions and they use 6 and they say, I'm done, I don't want to come back anymore. You need to think about these things beforehand. I'm not saying you give refunds. I'm saying you think about it and it goes in your contract. And then, of course, I think this is really important, Rory, and I'm going to back to you on this one because you are our information officer within Counselling Tutor.
I am.
Records and data protection. Now, I'm
Oh,
going to
yes.
I'm just going to put in here, Rory, records, yes, that was covered in my training. But all those many years ago when I was training, there was very little on data protection other than that there was a privacy law. But now, of course, that has changed dramatically with technology.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it was 2018 that the Data Protection Act came in. Or GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, and it's made life a little more complex, but it can be streamlined. And therapists, those who are practicing and carry client information such as phone numbers and any data, addresses, anything like that, should register with the Information Commissioner's Office, and that's really for the qualified amongst us. If you're a student, and the information that you're using is stored on the database of your practice, where you're hosting your practice from, then they will have their own data protection officer. But they would need to know, clients would need to know how long you keep data for, that they can get access to their clinical notes. They can ask for their clinical notes, and you have to give them. I think it's within 22 days now. I'd have to look up the actual time and how long you keep them before they're destroyed. So, and who can see them? I think that's an interesting one. Who can see them? And I think for students doing essays, because it is a student section, as it stands in the UK, the people who can access clients' notes are as follows. The client, if they request them, a judge with a court order. So if a judge issues a court order, they can be subpoenaed, and a coroner. And those are the only people that can access them. And occasionally we do get our colleagues in the police doing what they should do, which is asking for client notes. And in a case like that, I think the best way of handling that is to say to our colleagues in the police, well, if you speak to the client and the client requests them, I'll give them to them. They can pass them on. And if there's some issue with that, for instance, the client's reluctant and the Crown Prosecution Service, with the prosecutors in the UK, decide that they need to see them, they could go and get a court order, in which case you're legally bound to give them up. But I also want to mention that contracting is a gradual thing within student progression. So when we do our introduction courses, no one ever mentions contracts.
Yeah.
The only contract that I ever mentioned when you taught was you've got 30 minutes, 15 minutes each way, and that was basically it. And then when you move to like certificate, it's a bit more formal, because that's something that's examined. The examining boards look at contracting and look at time boundaries. And then when you get to diploma or degree level, you then it's more formal. And I would say to any students out there, think about contracting. No matter what level of course you're on, think about it, because it's something that's going to be in your future, and significantly in your future. I'm glad you mentioned TA, because I don't think it'd be right to mention contracts without contracts that are specific to some therapies. So the contracting Ken and myself have discussed is the business contract, the procedural contract, I used to like to call it. But actually, you could have therapy contracts. And when I was training, one of my tutors was having TA therapy, transactional analysis. And one of the therapy contracts, which is like a goal in therapy, was for her not to go mad. That was the actual contract. And the idea of that was to highlight the fact that as the therapy unfolded, it might become very uncomfortable. And, indeed, my ethical body, or professional body, the National Counselling Psychotherapy Society, talks about in your contract having things might get worse before they get better. And sometimes in a therapy contract, you put that in. You might put that in your normal contract, in your procedural contract. And the other one is that in TA therapy, they have something called escape hatches. which I'm led to believe, I'm not a TA therapist, but they're like a way of clients withdrawing into old patterns of behaviour to try and escape the realities of their life. And part of that is in a therapy contract, you'd say we're going to close the escape hatches. In other words, the therapy is going to confront, to some extent, your limiting beliefs, your limiting beliefs. And if you're a TA therapist, and I've got that slightly wrong, please don't write me a missive. No letters in the post bag. But therapy contracts are a thing in other therapies. CBT, for instance, you might be asked to do some homework, or you might be contracted to keep a diary. Those would be therapy contracts. So contracting does fall into different areas, but mainly the contracting Ken and myself have discussed today are procedural contracts. They're the ones where the client knows exactly what they're getting. Yes. They can make an informed choice. And should things go wrong, you have, as a therapist, a base for defensible decision-making. First thing you'll be asked by an ethical body is, well, let's have a look at your contracts. And if it's well written and it's been signed by the client or acknowledged by the client, then you're going to be in a better position.
Thank you, Rory. So just a précis, so on records and data protection, we need to explain how session notes and personal data are stored, how they are kept secure, how they are used. We need to say how long the records are retained for. All of this in your contract. You need to outline the client's rights under the data protection laws wherever you may find yourself. So if you're here in the UK, that would include UK GDPR. And then any use of third-party software or platforms, their compliance and their data privacy laws. Build them into your contract, what you are using, and links to their data privacy. Ending the counselling relationship is another one. I've got a number of things covering in that you should be looking at if you're writing about contracts for your assignments. Ending the counselling relationship, how and when counselling may end, including planned endings or termination initiated by the counsellor or the client. I get back down to, I've got 10 sessions of therapy, and after 6 sessions, the client goes, I'm done. Well, do they have the right to say, you know what, I'm finished now, I feel I'm done, I'm not just going to come here and sit here for 4 sessions. It sits within their rights. And if we put it in the contract that is outlined beforehand. And then, of course, the all-important boundaries, the professional boundaries of how we work, the rules of engagement, I guess, the nature of the counselling relationship, that professionally held relationship. And we allude to this in other episodes where we speak about things like what happens when you meet the client outside of the session and you're at a club and they're there, or at a restaurant and they're at a table. So this is the nature of the relationship. It's covered in your boundaries in your contract. Communication outside of the session. Can they email you? Can they phone you? What does that look like for you and your practice? Social media and dual relationships, not connecting on social platforms. Again, we see this in comments on our Facebook groups. But by the way, you can join that. Go to Facebook, put in Counselling Tutor, come and join us. Saying, can one of my clients, his friend, requested me on Facebook. What do I do? Well, you cover it in your contract under boundaries beforehand, so that when the client is there and you have that introductory session, you're covering all of this information so they have it. Complaints procedure. You need a complaints procedure. We have a complaints procedure available through our ethical bodies. How can a client raise a concern? We put that in our contract. Details of your professional body and how they might do that. Emergency support. We might put that in a contract, So we might contract around when and how they can contact you. And well, what happens if they have a crisis in between sessions? Well, we might put in additional layer of support. We might outline in our contract that we are not a crisis service, because we can't be. We can't be there at 3:00 in the morning when the person has a need. And then consent, very, very important. And this is another one that I see again and again in the Facebook group, people talking about it, how you get consent. You really need the client to sign and date the contract. Again, we started this by saying, if a complaint is levied against you, the first document that's going to be pulled out is your contract. And if your contract, if you say, well, I showed it to them and they said in our session that yeah, that was fine. Well, I wonder what stands better in the eyes of the board that might be looking at this. An unsigned contract or a signed and dated contract that contains your signature and date and the client's signature and date. And we live in an age of technology now where it's not difficult to digitally sign documentation and to hold proof that was digitally signed on a certain day and a certain time. And then, of course, we would end with any kind of optional clauses that relate to you, maybe the setting that you work within, or the agency or the client specification group that you're working with, or where you are in your arc of therapy. So if you're a student, under optional clauses, you may be saying when you're working in placement that you are a placement counsellor and that you take parts of the session to a supervisor because you're using their details there, and that you might use part of their details in professional discussion within your university or your college, wherever you are training. These are these optional clauses that will vary depending on where you are, what kind of client group you're working with, what the agency may stipulate. And there it is. So I'm going to go through these. Basic information, number 1. Number 2, purpose of counselling. Number 3, session details. Number 4, fees and payment. Number 5, confidentiality. Number 6, records and data protection. Number 7, ending the counselling relationship. Number 8, boundaries. Number 9, complaints procedures. Number 10, emergency contact support. Whoa, sounds like the top 10.
I was going to say, the top 40 on a Sunday.
The top 40, yeah. I just need some background music. Number 11, informed consent, and then optional clauses as well. And that is the end of student services and contracting. And this has been episode 324 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com.
It has, and we started with ethical and sustainable practice. Ken and myself had a discussion about managing risk in online therapy, the very big difference between managing risk in the room, where the client's in the room with you, and managing risk when you're working remotely with clients. Practice matters, we moved on to, and an interview with Meg Moss from the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, part 3 of a 3-part series of interviews on the topic of regulation and should the profession be regulated, and 3 very differing voices discussing regulation, and really a must listen to. And finally, student services, the importance of contracting, why we contract, who's it for, and what needs to be in a contract. And finally, I'd like to ask people, if you've enjoyed this, share it on your social media far and wide, send it to your contacts so lots of people can listen in and get hold of this information. And I'd like to also thank those people who've left wonderful reviews on the iTunes platform or Facebook or any other platform where there can be reviews. We love a good review, and we thank those people who've taken the time to do it. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.